Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Wise, and thank you very much for tuning in today for some Texas history. Well, if you've spent any time in Texas, especially out in the country, you've run into barbed wire, probably literally. In fact, I'm not sure you can be a Texan before you get stabbed trying to grab the wrong section of a barbed wire fence, and you darn sure can't call yourself a Texan until you ruin that new work shirt or punch a hole in those Wranglers trying to cross a fence. In fact, I've hit one of those milestones of age where this early dove season, I walked an extra 100 yards to a gate rather than try to cross a barbed wire fence. And by the way, that fence was fairly new and very well built in my defense. So I had to go walk to the gate to get the bird because I wasn't willing to bleed for it. But there's a reason that there's so much barbed wire in Texas. It's because it works. It keeps livestock in, it keeps trespassers out, but it really is a fairly new invention. So let's take a look at how the devil's rope came to be and get wise about Texas. Well, we've all heard the phrase, good fences make good neighbors, and no doubt that's true, and in some cases that's especially true. And to start any discussion about a fence, you got to talk about a little bit about property law. The United States adopted English property law, and therefore Texas has English property law. And the essence of that property law is exclusive use. In other words, the right to keep people out of your land. You have the right to use your land however you want to use it. Well, how do you enforce that? You enforce it with a fence. Now, there's an interesting twist to that because the barbed wire fences that we're going to talk about served two primary purposes when it was invented. One was to protect crops from invading livestock, and the other was to keep livestock in their designated area and out of public spaces or the neighbor's land. Now, I want you to hold that thought because we're going to return to that concept in a minute. But as Texas became settled, the settlers brought their ideas of fences with them. And before barbed wire, there were some interesting ideas. In East Texas, for example, you'd see a lot of wooden fences. And that makes sense because if you travel through the Southeast or Virginia or the Carolinas, you see a lot of wooden fences. And those were folks that came to Texas fairly early. As the Germans came to the Texas Hill Country, they started to build stone fences. And if you go to Europe, you will see several of those types of fences. Another way that fences were built would be to build hedges. And that you see that a lot in Europe. You see a lot in England. And there's actually we've talked about the German immigration on this podcast many times, and one of the commissioners of the Adelsverein, that organization that brought the German immigrants, was Prince Karls of Solms-Braunfels. And he wrote about Texas and reported seeing hedge fences in the middle 1840s. And here, I'll just read you the quote. This is the head of the Adelsverein describing what he sees as with Texas settlers. Quote, "Some have already begun to fence in fields by piling the dirt up 2 or 3 feet and planting thorny hedges on top. Those in a short time grow to a considerable height and form an impenetrable barrier. This protects the field much better than the other kind of fencing and is not at all expensive, and it also requires less work." Close quote. So people would build up dirt and plant a hedge. Now, that would be fairly effective if it would grow. And of course, we all know about Texas weather. So that probably was not a long-term solution. Now, I want to go back to the law for a second because I mentioned earlier protecting your property sometimes meant keeping livestock out or keeping livestock in. Well, early American common law allowed stock owners to graze their livestock unattended on any unfenced land. In other words, we know that here in Texas as the open range. And it didn't matter really where the owner was. Now, in England, and of course this is before the founding of America. This is the 1600s. The English law required that owners of livestock keep their animals in pens or have them attended at all times, and held the owners responsible for damage that livestock did to unfenced crops. Now, when America was founded, we had way more land than we had people, so the responsibility was put on the farmer to keep the livestock out of his crops. So that's a little bit of a conflict in the law, and that really, the last part of that, where the farmer had to keep the livestock out, was really the law in the South until almost the 20th century. And that was a question that was hotly debated in America, especially in the agriculture community. And so you can imagine the conflict between a farmer trying to raise a crop to sell or consume and the stock raiser whose cattle are wandering all over the place. Now, that wouldn't matter as much in far west Texas as Texas became settled, but it would sure matter a lot in East Texas. The worst offenders, by the way, tended to be hogs. So even in early America, we had this issue between open range and fenced range. So fast forward to the 1800s and think about Western Texas. Western Texas, if you want to know how big Texas is, drive anywhere around West Texas. And if that's not close enough, then drive to the Panhandle, and you will know just how big West Texas is. And the law up there and out there was open range for the longest and into the late 1800s. And that makes sense. In fact, there were a lot of cattlemen who were very wealthy who owned no land at all. They just owned cattle, and those cattle would graze on public land or on other people's land, and there weren't really any fences, partly because of the open range, but partly because what are you going to build them out of? There's very few trees, and there just wasn't a practical way to build a fence. But into the 1870s, after the Civil War, you pretty much knew where the cattle belonged. Of course, cattle brands were very important, and if cattle mixed and wandered onto somebody else's land, well, when the big roundup in the spring and in the fall, you just separate them out and drive them back to their home range, sort them out. Well, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, and what that did was, that was 1862, it allowed people to homestead 160 acres of public land for a very nominal fee, but the deal was you had to live on it and cultivate it for at least 5 years. So what that did was spread civilization west at a rapid clip. Many of those people were farmers, and when they came to the Great Plains, they encountered geography they had never seen before. And there really wasn't anything on those plains, as I mentioned before, to build a fence with. But they had to have fences because they had to keep the cattle out, the wildlife out, the buffalo out. So the need for an inexpensive and easy to build and effective fence became urgent. Well, a logical solution for that was wire. So people would try fencing with smooth wire. Well, let me tell you, that ain't going to keep any bovine of any size from going anywhere it wants to go. It especially isn't going to keep a buffalo Bison are notorious disrespecters of fences. So smooth wire was not a very effective solution. Now, having said that, I might mention that, and this comes out of J. Frank Dobie book, but I've seen the results of this, so this is likely pretty accurate, that Captain Mifflin Kennedy, he was partners with Richard King in the first ranches south of Corpus Christi, which of course are now the King Ranch and the Kennedy Ranch. And Kennedy used smooth wire in 1872 to start fencing some of his big pastures, and Richard King followed his example. And the fact of the matter is, you're not going to see any barbed wire on the King Ranch today. They use smooth wire fences, but they're also configured in such a way that they will hold. But that's the exception, not the rule. There was a patent for a wire fence that was issued to a man named Meriwether in 1853, in New Braunfels. Now, his fence had single strands of wire, but it also had a wooden rail. So that wasn't a pure wire fence, but people were starting to think about how they could get this done. Now, there was an interesting story I came across of a Swiss guy in Austin. His name was Grinninger, and he worked in an iron foundry, but he also had an orchard and a garden about half a city block. Now, I've been unable to locate in the property records where exactly John Grinninger's orchard was, but if anybody listening to this has some access to some old property records in Austin, I would love to know where this orchard was. But apparently Grinninger, the board fence, he had a board fence around his garden and orchard, and that wasn't enough to protect it from stray cattle. Can you imagine today cattle and hogs just wandering the streets of Austin? Well, they did. So in 1857, Grinninger came up with an idea to add wire to his fence and attach some hoop iron and some jagged metal to the wire. And some say that he attached some broken glass to the wire to keep people and animals out. So not exactly sure how well that worked, but we are sure that Grinninger was not very popular. And in fact, he was robbed and murdered in 1862. But that was an early attempt to do something to make a wire fence more effective. So now we need to travel to DeKalb, Illinois, the DeKalb County Agricultural Fair in 1873. There were 3 individuals at that fair at the same time. One, Joseph Glidden, another, Isaac Elwood, and a third, Jacob Heisch. So they're at the fair, and they witnessed a demonstration of a wire fence that was strung with boards, and into the boards were driven nails such that they stuck out horizontally and provided the deterrent that the barbed wire fence provides. So Glidden and Elwood, all 3 of these guys realized that this could be significant. So Glidden and Elwood quickly formed a company. Heisch formed his own company. And the key to this thing was to find a way to make it. There was actually a patent. There was a guy from Ohio that applied for a patent. And by the way, why is this all coming from the Midwest? Because these are these farmers that have to keep the livestock out. There was a patent from a guy named Lucian Smith in Ohio that had barbs or spurs on a wire fence, and they were fixed, and that was a big deal to keep these things fixed because you could string wire through anything, but it would slide up and down the wire. So he had these barbs that were fixed. The problem was it was very hard to attach them, and so it was very labor intensive to make the fence. Well, that doesn't help you because you need a lot of the fence. So Glidden and Elwood found a process where they could twist the barbs onto the fence, and that was a more practical production method, and they could make a lot of it. So Glidden receives the patent for this version of barbed wire and a patent for the way that the wire was made. And Glidden made this first barbed wire in his kitchen. He actually used a coffee grinder to twist the wire. So he got this patent. Now, he would end up in litigation over this patent until they expired in 1892. However, in the meantime, he got very wealthy. Glidden's company produced over 3 million pounds of barbed wire a year. And what he did was he ordered the wire, the raw material, from a company in Worcester, Massachusetts called Washburn and Moen. And the guys at Washburn and Moen were a little curious about what this guy in the Midwest was doing with all this wire. So they go over there to see. And once they saw what Glidden was onto, they decided that he had a good thing. So they offered him $60,000. This is back in the 1800s, $60,000 for the company. So Glidden took it, but he reserved a 25-cent royalty on every 100 pounds of barbed wire that were made. And before that patent expired, that royalty alone would make Glidden over $1 million. Now, this fence was designed to protect crops from livestock, but could also, as we've discussed, keep livestock in. So where do you think Glidden and Elwood knew that their biggest potential market was after the Civil War. After the Civil War, cattle prices went through the roof, and that was the advent of the big ranching industry in Texas and the cattle drives and all the things that we love to talk about and make part of the Texas identity. And so Texas obviously was their big major potential market. So Glidden and Elwood hired a salesman named Henry Sanborn, and they sent him to Texas. Now let me digress for just a minute, because Henry Sanborn is a pretty interesting guy. He was from New York, but he had moved to DeKalb to go to work for Joseph Glidden's company. He actually lived with Glidden. He ended up marrying Glidden's niece. He became a home builder in Denver. He became a horse trader. But it was in 1875 that Glidden wanted him to go to Texas. So he comes down to Texas, and it's said that he sold the first spool of this barbed wire in Gainesville in far north Texas, and then sold about 30 more spools there around north central Texas. And after that, they were off and running. They established a sales office in Houston. One of the ranches they sold some barbed wire to was the Coleman Methodist and Fulton Company in Rockport. That's the when you read about ranching history, you read a lot about the Coleman Fulton Pasture Company, and they had some huge ranches between Rockport and Corpus. In just a year, Sanborn sold about $1 million worth of this barbed wire. Now, he bought a ranch in East Texas, but he also formed a partnership with his uncle-in-law, Glidden, and this is 1881, to establish a ranch in the Panhandle called the Frying Pan Ranch. That ranch is still there near Amarillo, by the way. Anybody listening up in the Panhandle, love to take a tour of the Frying Pan Ranch. Sanborn also became a horseman, loved his show horses and his race horses. He used to put on his own horse show in Dallas. He donated the place where he put on this horse show, he finally donated to the city of Dallas, and it is now Fair Park. So Sanborn and derivatively barbed wire built the State Fair of Texas and the Cotton Bowl. He platted a town site on the eastern edge of the Frying Pan, and was successful in getting the county seat of Potter County, Amarillo, relocated to this town site. So Sanborn is known as the father of Amarillo. So he was a very interesting guy, but it was barbed wire that gave him his start when he came to Texas for his uncle-in-law, Joseph Glidden. Now we need to talk about another salesman, and this gentleman was named John W. Gates. Gates was from Illinois, and he went to DeKalb, and he offered to be partners with Elwood. Remember, Glidden had sold by this time. Gates wanted to be partners in Elwood's business. Elwood, of course, declined that, but he did hire Gates to go down to Texas, like Sanborn, and be a salesman. Now, I need to mention, I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you think about how the cattlemen might have reacted to barbed wire in Texas, it was not universally accepted. In fact, it was actively resisted by several famous cattlemen. There's one that you may have heard of called Abel Pierce. His nickname was Shanghai, and Shanghai Pierce ranched in Brazoria County in South, and he was very much against barbed wire because he and other cattlemen could imagine their cattle testing that wire, ending up scraping themselves, cutting themselves, and then they'd be susceptible to screwworm infections, which would eventually kill them. So this was not something that everybody liked the idea of. But Gates was a pretty good salesman, so he came down to Texas, and what he decided to do, he went to San Antonio, and what he decided was that they needed a show to demonstrate how effective this barbed wire was. And so Gates decided to put on a demonstration, and what he did was he built a barbed wire pen in Alamo Plaza. Now, I need to mention something. If you read various sources about this event, some will say that it occurred on the main plaza, some will say that it occurred on the military plaza, both of which are west of the Alamo. But the historical marker on the Menger Hotel commemorating this event says that it occurred on Alamo Plaza. But no matter where it occurred, it occurred. And so Gates builds this pen and doesn't tell anyone why he's doing it. But once he got the pen built, he announced that pen right there would hold the wildest cattle in Texas. So ranchers from around the area brought their craziest longhorn steers. Now, I got to tell you, I do have a little personal experience with a couple of crazy longhorn steers. And when they get those horns twirling, they can be pretty dangerous and they can be pretty effective in going where they want to go. And Texas cattle were known around the country to be wild and hard to manage. Now, the cattlemen in San Antonio looked at this flimsy wire fence and thought there is no way that this is going to hold all those cattle. So in they came. Now, it's rumored that there were wagers placed. Well, I think that's probably more than rumor. Can't you imagine? That's the first thing you'd want to do is bet on whether this wire fence could hold these wild Texas cattle. Well, the report is that the cattle made 2 or 3 runs at the fence, and after that, just wandered around confused. But the one thing they would not do is touch that barbed wire fence, and it held all those cattle. Well, they just couldn't believe it. And Gates was more than happy to invite everybody into the lobby of the Menger Hotel to place their orders for wire. And you can go into that lobby and see right where that happened. Well, Gates sold so much of that wire in Texas that he realized he needed a raise. So he went back up to company headquarters and asked Elwood for a partnership. Elwood wasn't interested. So Gates got mad and he moved to St. Louis and he formed his own company, the Southern Wire Company. And he was going to make his own barbed wire. And so he became the foremost manufacturer of what they called moonshine wire, which was wire basically in violation of the patent. And barbed wire, if you go through, and I'm not going to bore you with patent records, but I did, being a lawyer, of course, I had to go look at some of them. And there are a ton of patents for different types of barbed wire. This was a big deal in the late 1800s. There's a funny story. Gates was making this moonshine wire in St. Louis, and apparently Elwood, of course, sued him and got an injunction for him to stop. But before they could serve the injunction on him, he took all his manufacturing equipment, put it on a barge, pushed it across the Mississippi River to Illinois, and when they would try to serve him in Illinois, he reportedly pushed it back across the river to Missouri. So I don't know if that's true, but it sounds good. If it's not true, it ought to be. So finally, all of that settled down, and barbed wire continued. The use of barbed wire continued to expand all over the country, and it became the standard for fencing all over the place. Now, I want to spend a few minutes in closing on Gates, the moonshine wire maker, because he, like Sanborn, had a pretty interesting life. He was known as a risk taker, and that should be obvious. He wasn't afraid to violate those patents and just start his own manufacturing, etc. But he was also fairly inventive, and he would end up building several wire companies and a couple of steel companies. He actually got a patent on a manufacturing process for steel that he ended up selling to United States Steel. He also, and this originated when he needed to ship the barbed wire around, he invested in railroads, and that alone earned him yet another fortune. And his risk-taking became most famous when he was in England. This is 1900. And in England at a horse race, he bet $70,000 on a horse named Royal Flush. And that bet won him $600,000 in 1900. So that's over $22 million today, according to the internet calculator. But because of that bet, he got the nickname Bet-A-Million. So he was known as John Bet-A-Million Gates. But I got to say, one of probably his best investment ever was there was an oil driller in southeast Texas, named Patillo Higgins, who was drilling a well west of present-day Beaumont, and he needed help to get that well continued. And so Gates loaned him the money, and that well would become Spindletop. So talk about a fortune. and Gates had the golden touch. He ended up forming the Texas Company, which became Texaco, was a great supporter of the town of Port Arthur, and a very, very rich man. Well, by the late 1800s, most of the big ranches in the Panhandle, including the XIT and others, were the JA. They had fenced their pastures with barbed wire. And of course, now, though it's painful to handle, hard to handle, painful to cross, barbed wire fences are certainly here to stay. I looked up the market for barbed wire in 2023 was over $30 million. And very few inventions have changed the culture of a state like barbed wire did for Texas, and the ability to cut up the open range into individual plots of land had a tremendous effect on Texas. And it all started from those three guys at the DeKalb County Fair. Well, normally I would have a segment called Getting There where you could go see some of the places I mentioned in the episode. I will mention that if you're in San Antonio, definitely go by the Menger Hotel, go tour the historic lobby, and you'll find the historical marker on about Gates's demonstration in Alamo Plaza. And you won't have to go very far, no matter where you are in Texas, to go find you some barbed wire. But look and don't touch. Well, that wraps it up for another episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks for listening today. Follow us on Instagram and X at Wise About Texas. Like and share the Facebook page if you're so inclined. And if you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Wise About Texas. Thanks again for listening. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.